Welcome to your deep dive. Today we're going to be cracking open Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart and really kind of exploring the world of human emotions. You've given me some really fascinating excerpts from the book, and we're excited to dive in and see what makes these feelings tick and how they influence our lives.
Well, I think what's really fascinating about this book is how Brown approaches emotions as like actual places we go,
Yeah,
And it's a really cool way to think about how they're not just static things we label, but dynamic experiences that really kind of shape how we see the world.
like an emotional
That's,
GPS system
you're sure.
for all the ups and downs, right?
Exactly.
And we've got quite a roadmap here, from those familiar feelings of disappointment and regret to like the awe-inspiring stuff,
Mhm.
and even touching on some darker emotions like anguish and dehumanization.
Yeah, it's going to be quite the journey. One thing that really struck me as I was reading through these excerpts is how Brown weaves her personal experiences into her research. She talks about her childhood, her sharp observation skills, even how she used horror movie tropes to understand her early intuition.
Horror movies as emotional guides. Okay, that's a new one for me. But it really shows how this work comes from a deeply personal place,
Absolutely.
not just an academic standpoint.
Exactly, and that makes her insights all the more relatable. Speaking of relatable, one thing that really resonated with me was her discussion about how most of us have a pretty limited emotional vocabulary.
Mhm.
She even did a study where people could only name an average of 3 emotions.
3.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Happy, sad, angry. End of story. That's it. No wonder we struggle to understand ourselves and each other, right? It's
Mhm.
like trying to paint a masterpiece with only like 3 colors.
That's a great analogy. And that's where Brown's work, I think, becomes so important because by mapping out 87 emotions and experiences in the book, she provides us with this richer language to understand what we're feeling and why.
So it's like upgrading from crayons to a full artist palette.
Exactly.
I like that. All right. So with this new palette, what kind of emotions are we uncovering?
Well, you highlighted a really interesting one in the excerpts you sent over, foreboding joy. It's that feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop even when things are good. Like you can't fully embrace the happiness.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. It's like bracing yourself for disappointment, even when things are going great.
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
It can be, for sure. And Brown suggests that this often stems from past experiences, where joy was followed by pain or letdown. So it's like our emotional wiring gets a little messed up, making it hard to fully trust those happy moments.
That makes a lot of sense. So if foreboding joy is us sort of bracing for impact,
Yeah.
is there a way to break that cycle?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Brown believes that practicing gratitude can be a powerful antidote.
Oh, interesting. And you sent me some excerpts on gratitude. What's Brown's take on it?
Well, she really challenges us to think about gratitude, not just as a feeling, but as an action. She talks about actively seeking out things to appreciate, even in challenging situations, and how this can actually shift our focus and magnify the impact of those positive aspects.
So it's about being intentional with our gratitude, not just waiting for it to happen,
Exactly.
like a muscle we need to exercise.
Yes.
Okay, I like that. So the next time I feel that creeping dread, even when things are good,
Hmm.
I need to stop and maybe just list 3 things I'm grateful for in that moment.
I love that.
Yeah, a quick gratitude check-in. Maybe that can help rewire my emotional response. And speaking of gratitude, it seems like it ties into another emotion that you highlighted, and that's anguish.
Ah, yes. Anguish. This is a heavy hitter for sure, and Brown doesn't shy away from it. Her description of her own experience with anguish after receiving a traumatic phone call is incredibly raw and powerful.
It's a reminder that even the toughest emotions are part of the human experience, right?
Absolutely.
But how do we deal with something as intense as anguish? I mean, do we just power through it?
Well, not quite. While feeling anguish is a normal human response to trauma, Brown emphasizes that processing it with support is essential to prevent it from becoming debilitating. That's where having a strong support network, friends, family, a therapist, can really make all the difference.
So she's not suggesting that we go it alone, right?
Yeah, not at all.
It's interesting how she contrasts that with the experience of gratitude, where it seems more about that internal shift in perspective.
It's almost like a balancing act, right? Sometimes we need to look inward to shift our mindset, and sometimes we need to reach out for support to help us process.
Okay, I like that. So we've talked about the fear of good things with foreboding joy and the heaviness of anguish. But what about the emotions that seem, well, a bit less than ideal? Like you included an excerpt on Schadenfreude. Is it always bad to feel a little twinge of pleasure when someone else messes up?
Schadenfreude is a tricky one because it kind of sits on this spectrum. I mean, think about it. Are you relieved when a corrupt politician faces consequences?
Yeah.
That's different from actively wishing harm on someone who cut you off in traffic, right?
Hmm.
So Brown really makes us examine that line.
So it's not about condemning the emotion outright,
Hmm?
but rather understanding the context and the intention. That
Exactly.
seems very in line with her overall approach.
Right. It's about bringing awareness to our emotional landscape, not just labeling things as good or bad.
Yeah.
And that awareness gives us the power to then make conscious choices about how we respond.
I'm already starting to see how this emotional literacy can be so empowering.
It really is. And this brings us to another important concept that Brown explores, the difference between belonging and fitting in.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the distinction?
Well, fitting in is all about conforming,
Yeah.
trying to blend in and be like everyone else.
Right.
But belonging, as Brown describes it, is about embracing our authentic selves and finding our place where we can truly be seen and accepted for who we are.
So it's less about changing who we are to fit a mold and more about finding a space where we can genuinely be ourselves.
Precisely. And she even includes this powerful visual in the book. It's a drawing of middle schoolers
Oh.
holding up signs with the differences between belonging and fitting in
Yeah.
that they came up with themselves.
Middle schoolers are the experts on that whole social dynamic, right?
Right.
What were some of the things they highlighted?
Well, they were actually very insightful. They said things like belonging is being accepted for who you are, while fitting in is pretending to be someone you're not. Belonging is being part of something bigger than yourself, while fitting in is trying to be like everyone else.
Wow, that's powerful. That's a reminder that true belonging starts with self-acceptance. And that's a message that resonates at any age.
It really does. And this ties into Brown's discussion on loneliness, which she defines as not just being physically alone, but about that feeling of disconnection.
Right. So even if you're surrounded by people, you can still feel lonely if you don't feel like you belong.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that loneliness can actually trigger this self-preservation mode in our brains, which ironically can hinder connection.
Oh, wow.
It's like a vicious cycle. We feel lonely, so we withdraw, which makes us feel even more lonely.
So how do we break out of that cycle?
Well, Brown suggests that the solution lies in recognizing those feelings of loneliness
Ah.
as a signal to actively seek out meaningful connection, even when it feels scary or uncomfortable. It's about fighting that urge to withdraw and instead reaching out.
That takes a lot of courage,
Yeah.
especially when you're feeling vulnerable
Yeah,
and afraid of rejection.
it does, but it's that courage to connect that can
Yeah.
ultimately lead us to those authentic relationships where
Uh-huh.
we feel truly seen and understood.
That makes sense. It seems like connection is a major theme in Alice of the Heart.
It definitely is. And this leads us to another powerful concept that Brown introduces, and that's practicing the courage to walk alongside.
Okay, I like that phrase. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's about being present with someone in their experience, offering support and empathy without judgment, or trying to control the outcome. It's about power with rather than power over.
That's really subtle but important shift, isn't it,
It is.
in how we approach supporting others.
It is.
And I can see how that relates to her discussion of empathy versus sympathy, where she calls sympathy the near enemy of empathy. Why is that?
Well, sympathy creates distance. It's that's terrible for you, not me response. But empathy, on the other hand, builds connection through the shared understanding of me too, I get it. It's about meeting someone where they are, not trying to pull them up to where we think they should be.
That's a profound distinction, and it reminds me of something else you highlighted, the importance of narrative trust.
Ah, yes, narrative trust.
What is that?
Well, narrative trust is about believing people when they share their stories and experiences. It's about resisting the urge to interrupt or dismiss or minimize their experience.
Right.
It's about creating a space for their truth to be heard and validated.
So it sounds a lot like what Brown describes as walking alongside someone, honoring their perspective and their journey, even if it's different from our own.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that initial concept of emotional literacy. The more we understand our own emotions and the emotions of others, the better equipped we are to connect in these meaningful and supportive ways.
It's like we're building a toolkit for navigating the complexities of human connection.
Precisely.
Okay, I'm ready to add some more tools. But before we move on, let's take a moment to recap some key takeaways from this first part of our exploration. You ready for a little summary action?
I'm all for it. A good summary is like a mental bookmark, helps us remember the important stuff.
Okay, great. Here we go. First up, we talked about how Brown approaches emotions as places we go, emphasizing their dynamic experiences, not just static labels. And she uses her own personal stories to really bring those emotions to life.
And we talked about how most of us have a pretty limited emotional vocabulary, and how Atlas of the Heart provides a much richer language to understand ourselves and others.
I love that crayon versus artist's palette analogy.
It's a good one.
And speaking of expanding our emotional vocabulary, we dove into some specific emotions, starting with foreboding joy, that feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop, even when things are good.
And we talked about how practicing gratitude can be a powerful antidote to that.
Right, shifting our focus to those more positive aspects of our experience.
Mm.
Then we took a deep dive into anguish, that intense emotional response to trauma,
Mm.
and talked about how important it is to seek support.
Yes, processing it with support can prevent it from becoming debilitating.
We also explored the nuances of schadenfreude and how it can be both positive and negative depending on the context and the intention.
And then we shifted gears a bit to talk about the difference between belonging and fitting in, emphasizing that true belonging is about embracing our authentic selves, not conforming to external expectations.
Right, and we explored how loneliness can trigger this self-preservation mode
Mm.
that can hinder connection, highlighting how important it is to actively seek out those meaningful connections, even when it's challenging.
And finally, we touched on Brown's concept of practicing the courage to walk alongside others, which is all about being present with someone in their experience, offering support and empathy without judgment or control.
That's a lot to unpack in just this first part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good foundation for understanding the emotional landscape that Brown lays out.
I agree. And remember, this is just the beginning of our exploration. We have a lot more ground to cover, including some really practical takeaways
Mm-hmm.
that you can apply to your own life.
I can't wait. So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart, where
Oh, well,
we'll delve even deeper into the world of emotions.
it's going to be great.
See you soon.
See you soon. You know, as we were wrapping up that last section, I was thinking about how much of Brown's work really applies not just to our personal lives, but to our work lives as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, work can be such an emotional roller coaster these days, right?
Totally.
Deadlines, performance reviews, team dynamics, office politics. It's like a breeding ground for stress and anxiety,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
even conflict.
Exactly.
And if we don't have the tools to kind of navigate all those emotions effectively, it can impact, well, everything. Our productivity, our relationships with colleagues, even our own well-being.
It's like showing up to an emotional roller coaster without a safety harness.
Not a pretty picture.
Yeah.
So how does Atlas of the Heart help us to kind of buckle up
Yeah.
and ride those workplace emotions?
Well, I think Brown provides a really fantastic framework for understanding our own emotions and the emotions of the people we work with. And she gives us some really practical strategies for navigating those tricky interpersonal dynamics that inevitably come up, you know?
Okay, I'm ready to get practical.
Right.
What are some of the specific concepts that stood out to you as being really relevant to work life?
Well, one that immediately comes to mind is vulnerability. It's a word that I think makes a lot of people cringe, especially in a work setting.
Yeah.
There's this idea that vulnerability is a weakness and that we need to project this image of strength and competence all the time.
Right. We have to wear that professional armor
Exactly.
to protect ourselves.
But Brown actually challenges that whole notion. She argues that vulnerability is actually the key to building trust, fostering connection, and even sparking innovation. It's about taking off that armor and allowing ourselves to be seen, imperfections and all that.
That's a pretty radical concept,
Yeah.
especially in a world that often rewards putting on a brave face.
Yeah.
How does that vulnerability actually play out in a work environment?
Well, think about it this way. When we're willing to be vulnerable, to admit that we don't have all the answers, to ask for help, it gives other people permission to do the same. It creates this space for more authentic and collaborative interactions.
So it's less about being the expert all the time
Yeah.
and more about creating that culture of shared learning and support. I like that.
Does Brown give any examples of vulnerability in action in the workplace?
Yeah, she talks about leaders being willing to acknowledge their own mistakes, to actively seek feedback, and to create a culture where it's safe for others to do the same. So it's about leading by example.
If the leader is willing to be vulnerable, that sets the tone for the whole team. Absolutely. And she also talks about how vulnerability is really important when giving and receiving feedback. It's about approaching those conversations with empathy and humility and a genuine desire for growth, both for ourselves and for the other person.
Yeah, it takes the sting out of feedback,
Right.
right? And turns it into a more collaborative process. It almost seems like vulnerability is this like secret ingredient to building those stronger, more authentic relationships, both personally and professionally.
I think you're onto something there. Brown even encourages us to kind of reframe our thinking about vulnerability completely, to see it not as a weakness, but as a superpower. And you know what? Speaking of superpowers, another one that I think is really essential in the workplace is courage.
Ooh, I like a good superhero reference.
Right.
But when we talk about courage in the workplace, I'm guessing it's not always about those grand, heroic gestures.
Exactly. Courage in the workplace isn't about facing physical danger. It's about speaking up for what we believe in, even when it's unpopular. It's about challenging the status quo, advocating for ourselves and others, taking risks that push us outside of our comfort zones.
So those everyday acts of bravery, that might not make headlines, but can make a big difference in our work lives.
Exactly. And Brown believes that courage is a skill we can actually develop, just like any other skill. She provides some really practical strategies for cultivating courage, like setting boundaries, practicing vulnerability, and recognizing our own worthiness.
And those three things are all interconnected, aren't they? Boundaries, vulnerability, worthiness.
Yeah.
If we don't value ourselves,
hmm
we're less likely to set boundaries or be vulnerable.
Absolutely. It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
And Brown also talks about creating this culture of courage in the workplace, where
Mhm.
people feel safe to take risks, to speak their minds, and to challenge the norm.
So creating an environment that fosters that courage muscle
I,
like that. You know, this whole conversation about everyday acts of bravery
yeah.
reminds me of a time when I had to speak up against something I felt was wrong at work.
Oh, I'd love to hear about
It
that.
was a few years ago, and my team was working on this big project, and we were all under a lot of pressure to meet deadlines. And I noticed that one of my colleagues was being unfairly overloaded with work.
Oh, that's tough.
Yeah.
What did you do?
Well, at first, I hesitated. I didn't want to rock the boat or step on anyone's toes. But then I remembered something Brown said about courage being contagious.
No, yeah.
And I realized that if I didn't speak up, no one would. So I took a deep breath and I talked to my manager about the situation.
Wow, good for you. That took a lot of courage.
Well, and my manager was actually really receptive. She hadn't realized how unevenly the work was distributed. So she ended up adjusting the workload. And my colleague was so grateful. It was a small act of courage, but it made a big difference for my teammate and for the team as a whole.
That's a great example of how speaking up can really create positive change. And it highlights the importance of creating that culture of courage
Yeah.
that Brown talks about. You know, speaking of uncomfortable situations, Brown also dives deep into the emotion of shame, which can be especially crippling in the workplace.
Oh, yeah. Shame is such a heavy, insidious feeling. It's like that voice in our heads that tells us, I'm not good enough, or I'm a failure, I don't belong. It
Right.
can really hold us back, I think.
It definitely can. And Brand talks about how shame thrives in secrecy, silence, and judgment. It's like a monster that grows bigger the longer we keep it hidden in the dark.
Okay, so how do we slay that shame monster? Especially in a work environment
Yeah.
that can sometimes feel really competitive and judgmental.
Well, Brown argues that the antidote to shame is empathy. When we have the courage to share our experiences with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame loses its power over us. It's like shining a light on the monster and watching it shrink away.
So it's about breaking the silence, right?
Yeah.
Letting the light in and finding people we trust to share our struggles with.
Mm.
What are some other ways that we can cultivate that shame resilience?
Well, Brown emphasizes the importance of self-compassion. So instead of beating ourselves up when we make mistakes, it's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a friend.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that we're all human, we all make mistakes, and it's okay to not be perfect.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
Especially in a culture that often glorifies perfectionism, it's about giving ourselves permission to be human.
Exactly. And Brown offers some really practical strategies for developing shame resilience, like recognizing our shame triggers, challenging our negative self-talk, and reaching out for support when we need it. So it's about building up our emotional immune system, so to speak,
Mm.
so we can better handle those shame attacks.
Yeah, I can definitely see how shame can show up in the workplace, leading us to avoid taking risks
Mhm.
or overworking ourselves to prove our worth or becoming defensive when we receive feedback.
Absolutely. It can really sabotage our success and well-being. And, shame often fuels perfectionism, which can be another big challenge in the workplace.
Oh yeah, perfectionism, that drive to be perfect, to never make a mistake, sounds exhausting.
It is incredibly draining. That constant striving for perfection can lead to burnout, anxiety, and a fear of failure. It's like we're constantly chasing this impossible standard, and it just leaves us feeling inadequate and never good enough.
So how do we break free from that perfectionism trap?
Well, Brown encourages us to challenge those perfectionistic tendencies and to embrace our imperfections. It's about recognizing that we're all works in progress
Right.
and that making mistakes is actually part of the learning process. So it's about shifting our focus from being perfect to being wholehearted.
I like that shifting from perfect to
Yeah,
wholehearted.
right.
It's about embracing all parts of
Yeah.
ourselves, the good, the bad, and the messy.
Absolutely. And Brown reminds us that perfectionism is often driven by a fear of what other people will think. So it's about letting go of that need for external validation and focusing on living in alignment with our own values.
So we define success on our own terms, not based on someone else's expectations. And speaking of values, that brings us to another important concept that Brown explores: integrity.
Yes, integrity. Such
Yeah.
a powerful word.
Yeah.
It's about living in accordance with our values, even when it's difficult. It's about doing the right thing even when no one's watching. It's about being honest and transparent in our interactions with others.
It's about walking the talk, not just talking the talks.
Yeah.
So how does integrity show up in the workplace?
In countless ways, really. It's about being honest in our work, treating our colleagues with respect, taking responsibility for our actions, speaking up against injustice, and making ethical decisions, even when it's hard or unpopular.
So aligning our actions with our values, both big and small. Brown argues that integrity is essential for building trust and creating that culture of ethical behavior.
Right. Absolutely. And she really emphasizes the importance of leaders modeling integrity in their own actions and decisions. It's about setting the tone from the top down.
Right. And encouraging all of us to reflect on our own values and make sure our actions are aligned with what we believe in.
Yeah.
Living with integrity from the inside out.
I love that integrity from the inside out. And, speaking of aligning our actions with our values, that brings us to another emotion that's incredibly common in the workplace: disappointment.
Disappointment.
Oh.
It's inevitable, right?
It is.
I mean, we set goals, we have expectations, and sometimes things just don't go as planned.
That's part of life.
Yeah.
But Brown argues that it's how we handle disappointment that makes all the difference. She actually makes a really important distinction
Mm.
between two types of expectations: stealth expectations and examined and expressed expectations.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference?
Well, stealth expectations are those unexamined, unexpressed expectations that often lead to resentment and conflict. It's like we're setting ourselves up for disappointment because we're not being clear about what we want or need.
Right. If we don't communicate our expectations,
Mm,
we can't really expect other people to meet them.
exactly. And examined and expressed expectations, on the other hand, are those that are clearly communicated, which makes it easier to manage disappointment when things don't go our way.
So it's about being proactive and setting ourselves up for success.
I love that. And Brown also encourages us to kind of reframe our thinking about disappointment completely. So instead of getting stuck in blame or self-criticism, it's about asking ourselves, what can I learn from this experience? How can I adjust my expectations or my approach moving forward? It's about turning disappointment into an opportunity for growth.
So like turning those failures into valuable lessons.
Exactly. And Brown reminds us that disappointment is often a sign that we're stretching ourselves, that we're taking risks and putting ourselves out there. So instead of letting disappointment derail us, it's about using it as fuel to keep moving forward.
Disappointment as fuel. Okay, I like that. It's a much more empowering perspective. And, speaking of moving forward, that brings us to another emotion that can be really challenging, but also incredibly powerful: regret.
Regret. Such a heavy emotion to carry. It's about looking back on our past choices and wishing we had done things differently. And it can make us feel really stuck,
Yeah.
and full of self-blame.
Right. So how do we deal with regret in a healthy way? Do we just try to forget about it and move on?
Well, not necessarily. Brown actually encourages us to embrace regret as a teacher, to reflect on our choices, and to make amends when necessary. It's about acknowledging the past without letting it define us.
So learning from our mistakes and using those lessons to make better choices in the future. Turning regret into a catalyst for growth.
Exactly. And Brown reminds us that we can't change the past, but we can learn from it and make different choices moving forward. And she also highlights the importance of forgiveness, both for ourselves and for others, because holding on to regret or resentment only hurts us in the long run.
Right. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself.
Absolutely. And speaking of forgiveness, that brings us to another emotion that can be really toxic:
Yeah.
especially in the workplace, and that's resentment.
Oh, yeah. Resentment is like that bitter pill
Yeah.
that we keep swallowing, hoping it will make us feel better. But it just keeps poisoning us from the inside out.
That's a powerful image. And it's so true. Resentment is that feeling of bitterness and anger that we hold on to. When we feel wrong or treated unfairly, it's like this heavy weight that we carry around with us,
Well,
weighing us down and preventing us from experiencing joy and peace.
so how do we break free from those chains of resentment?
Well, Brown argues that resentment is often a sign that we haven't set healthy boundaries, that we might be saying yes when we really want to say no, or allowing others to take advantage of us. So it's about recognizing our worth and setting limits to protect ourselves.
Resentment can be a signal
Yeah,
that we need to prioritize our own needs and set some healthier boundaries.
exactly. And Brown provides some really helpful strategies for addressing resentment. This might involve having a difficult conversation with the person who's wronged us, or it might involve making a conscious decision to let go of the anger and the bitterness.
Yes,
How about taking back our power?
and she reminds us that holding on to resentment
Hmm.
really only hurts us in the long run. It keeps us stuck in the past and prevents us from moving forward.
Absolutely. And as we're talking about kind of letting go of these negative emotions, I think it's important to also acknowledge the positive emotions
Mhm.
that are so essential for a fulfilling work life. One that immediately comes to mind is gratitude.
Gratitude, one of my favorite topics.
Right.
Tell me more.
So, gratitude is all about appreciating the good things in our lives, both big and small. It's about shifting our focus from what we lack to what we have. And it can have a really profound impact on our happiness and well being.
There's that saying, it's not happy people who are grateful, it's grateful people who are happy.
That's so true. And Brown encourages us to make gratitude a daily practice. This might involve keeping a gratitude journal, expressing our appreciation to others, or simply taking a moment to notice and appreciate the good things in our lives, even those seemingly small things.
So training our brains to focus on the positive,
Exactly.
which can be a real game changer, I think,
Yeah,
especially in a work environment that can often feel stressful and demanding.
absolutely. And Brown reminds us that gratitude is contagious. So when we express gratitude, it inspires others to do the same, creating this ripple effect of positivity.
Ooh, I like that. A gratitude ripple effect. And speaking of positive emotions, another one that's crucial in the workplace is joy.
Yes, joy. That pure, unadulterated feeling of delight and happiness. It's the spark that makes work feel meaningful and fulfilling. It's what makes us want to jump out of bed in the morning and tackle the day with enthusiasm.
It's the opposite of burnout.
Exactly. And Brown argues that joy is not something that we should just take for granted. It's a precious gift that we need to cultivate and protect.
So how do we invite more joy into our work lives?
Well, Brown encourages us to seek out experiences that bring us joy. This might involve pursuing our passions, connecting with loved ones, or simply spending time in nature. It's about prioritizing those activities that nourish our souls and make us feel alive.
So creating space for the things that light us up,
Hmm.
both inside and outside of work.
Absolutely. And Brown reminds us that joy is often found in the simplest of things. A shared laugh with a colleague, a moment of connection with a client, a sense of accomplishment after completing a challenging task. It's about being present and noticing those little sparks of joy throughout our day.
Savoring those moments, both big and small. And, speaking of savoring, that brings us to another emotion that's so important for our well-being,
Mm.
especially in a hectic work environment. Peace.
Peace, that feeling of calmness and tranquility, that sense of being grounded and centered, even in the midst of chaos. It's like a deep breath of fresh air.
It sounds heavenly. How do we cultivate that sense of peace in a world that often feels anything but peaceful?
Well, Brown argues that peace is not something that we find, it's something that we create. It's about cultivating inner peace through practices like mindfulness and meditation, self-compassion,
Mhm.
learning to calm the storms within.
So it's an inside job.
It is, but it's also about creating a peaceful environment around us. This might involve setting boundaries, simplifying our lives, surrounding ourselves with positive and supportive people. It's about curating our external world to support our inner peace.
So it's about creating a sanctuary for our souls, both internally and externally.
Beautifully said. And Brown reminds us that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to remain calm and centered in the midst of conflict. It's about responding, not reacting.
That's a powerful distinction.
Mm.
Choosing how we respond, even in challenging situations.
Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive
Yeah.
into Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart, I think it's clear that her work has profound implications for the workplace, right? It's about So much more than just getting the job done. It's about cultivating a work life that is emotionally healthy, fulfilling, and meaningful.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that our emotions are not our enemies, but rather they're valuable sources of information that can guide us toward a more fulfilling and meaningful work experience. It's about bringing our whole selves to work, not just our professional selves.
Leading with our hearts, not just our heads. And speaking of bringing our whole selves to work, Brown introduces this really powerful concept that she calls collective vulnerability.
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting one. What does she mean by collective vulnerability?
Well, collective vulnerability is about recognizing that we're all in this together. It's about creating a culture where vulnerability is valued and where people feel safe to share their struggles and their triumphs, recognizing that we're stronger together than we are alone.
It's like a team sport for vulnerability.
I love that.
Right.
Yeah. And Brown argues that collective vulnerability is essential for creating a more just and equitable world. Because when we're willing to be vulnerable with each other, we break down the barriers that divide us, and we create a space for empathy, compassion, and understanding.
It's about moving from me to we.
Exactly. And Brown reminds us that collective vulnerability is not about weakness. It's about courage, connection, and the power of shared humanity. It's about recognizing that we're all in this human experience together with all of its messy imperfections.
So, how do we cultivate that collective vulnerability in the workplace? It sounds like a beautiful concept, but how do we actually make it happen?
Well, it starts with leaders modeling vulnerability. When leaders are willing to share their own struggles, to admit they don't have all the answers, it gives other people permission to do the same. It creates that ripple effect of vulnerability.
Leading with authenticity.
Exactly. And it's also about creating that culture of trust and respect, where people feel safe to speak up, to share their ideas, and to challenge the status quo without fear of retribution. It's about creating a space where everyone's voice is heard and valued.
So, psychological safety is a key ingredient here.
Absolutely. And it's also about recognizing that we all make mistakes. So instead of shaming or blaming each other, it's about offering support and encouragement. It's about creating a culture of learning and growth, where mistakes are seen as opportunities for development, not failures.
Yeah. Creating a space where it's okay to be human. And, speaking of being human, Brown also emphasizes the importance of celebrating our differences.
I love that. Diversity is such a strength,
Mm.
but it's often overlooked or even suppressed in the workplace, right?
Absolutely. Our unique perspectives and experiences are what make us stronger as a team. It's about embracing those differences, valuing them, and leveraging them to achieve our goals. It's about recognizing that there's no one right way to be, to think, or to work.
It's like creating this tapestry of perspectives,
Hmm.
with each thread adding richness and depth to the overall design.
Beautifully said. And finally, Brown emphasizes the importance of creating a shared sense of purpose. So when we're all working toward a common goal, it creates a sense of unity and connection that transcends our individual differences.
It's about working together towards something bigger than ourselves.
Mm.
And speaking of aligning our actions with our values,
Mm.
that brings us back to a concept that Brown has woven throughout Atlas of the Heart, the power of language.
Ah, yes, language. It's such a powerful tool. It can build us up or tear us down. It can create connection or division. It can inspire us or discourage us.
And Brown emphasizes how the words we use to describe our emotions can either help us process those emotions
Yeah.
or actually shut down that process. She even calls expanding our emotional vocabulary emotional granularity.
Yeah. And she makes a really compelling case that the richer and more nuanced our language is,
Yeah.
the better we understand ourselves. It's like having a more detailed map of our inner world.
Right. Going from a basic roadmap to a GPS with real-time traffic updates and alternate routes, we
Exactly.
have more information to work with,
Yeah.
which allows us to navigate more effectively.
And not just ourselves, but others too, right? If we can articulate what we're feeling, we can communicate it more effectively to the people around us,
Yeah.
which leads to stronger relationships, both personally and professionally.
It's like building bridges of understanding through language.
Beautifully said. And Brown gives this great example of how most people only use a handful of words to describe their emotions: happy, sad, angry, and that's it.
Yeah.
But what about all the shades in between? What about the subtle differences between disappointment and regret? Or between anxiety and fear?
Right. It's like trying to describe the entire spectrum of colors with just 3 crayons.
Exactly. By learning those finer distinctions, we gain more control over our emotional lives. Instead of being ruled by these vague feelings, we can identify the root cause and choose how to respond.
It's like becoming an emotional alchemist, right?
Yep.
Transforming those raw emotions into something more refined and nuanced.
I love that analogy.
Hmm.
Speaking of nuanced emotions, one that Brown explores in depth,
Hmm.
especially in relation to the workplace, is the difference between fitting in and belonging.
It's a distinction that can be really tricky to navigate, especially in a professional setting, where we're often trying to make a good impression and climb that corporate ladder.
Oh, absolutely. Fitting in is all about conforming. Yeah. About trying to be like everyone else, to blend in and not make waves. But belonging, as Brown describes it, is about being accepted for who you are, quirks and all. It's about finding a place where you can be your authentic self and still feel valued and connected.
So it's less about changing who we are to fit a mold and more about finding a space where we can genuinely be ourselves.
Precisely. And Brown even includes this really powerful visual in the book. It's a drawing of middle schoolers holding up signs with the differences between belonging and fitting in.
Oh, I remember those. Those kids were spot on.
They were.
They were saying things like, belonging is being accepted for who you are,
Mm,
while fitting in is pretending to be someone you're not. Belonging is being part of something bigger than yourself,
mm.
while fitting in is trying to be like everyone else.
Powerful, right?
Yeah. A reminder that true belonging starts with self-acceptance.
Absolutely.
And that's a message that resonates at any age.
It really does. And, this ties into Brown's discussion on loneliness, which she defines as not just being physically alone, but about that feeling of disconnection, of not belonging.
It's like that ache in your heart that longs for a place where you can truly be yourself
Hmm.
without judgment or pretense.
Beautifully said. And what's fascinating is that loneliness can actually trigger this self-preservation mode in our brains, which ironically can hinder connection. It's like a vicious cycle. We feel lonely, so we withdraw, which makes us feel even more lonely.
Right. So how do we break free from that cycle of loneliness and isolation?
Well, Brown's research suggests that the solution lies in recognizing those feelings of loneliness as a signal to actively seek out meaningful connection, even when it feels scary or uncomfortable. It's about fighting that urge to withdraw and instead reaching out.
Which takes courage, right?
Yeah,
Especially when we're feeling vulnerable and afraid of rejection.
it does. It does. But it's that courage to connect that can ultimately lead us to those authentic relationships where we feel seen and understood. And, speaking of connection, that brings us to another really important concept that Brown explores trust.
A trust is the foundation of any healthy relationship, right? Well, personally and professionally. It's the glue that holds everything together.
I couldn't agree more. And Brown provides this really helpful framework for understanding the key elements of trust. She breaks it down into braving, boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity.
Braving. Okay, that's a great acronym. It's like a checklist for building trust.
I know, right? And she emphasizes the importance of building trust gradually over time. It's not something that just happens overnight. It requires consistent effort, open communication, and a willingness to be vulnerable.
It's like a garden
Hmm.
that needs to be tended to regularly. You can't just plant the seeds and expect them to grow without any care or attention.
I love that analogy. And Brown reminds us that trust is fragile. It can be broken easily,
Mm.
and it takes time and effort to repair.
It's like a delicate vase that can be shattered with one careless bump.
Exactly. So how do we build trust in the workplace? It's not always easy,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially in environments where there's a lot of competition and fear of making mistakes.
Right. Well, Brown highlights some really practical strategies, and I think it starts with being reliable. Doing what we say we're going to do when we say we're going to do it. Following through on our commitments.
Absolutely. And it's also about being accountable for our actions. When we make mistakes, we own up to them and we take steps to make amends. We don't try to hide them or blame
Right,
others.
taking responsibility for our part.
Exactly. And it's also about setting healthy boundaries, knowing what we're willing to tolerate and what we're not.
Honoring our own needs and limits. And another key element of trust is being non-judgmental, right? Creating a space where people feel safe to share their thoughts and feelings without fear of criticism.
Absolutely. It's about creating a culture of psychological safety
Hmm.
where people feel comfortable being themselves and taking risks.
And it's also about being generous, right?
Well,
Giving people the benefit of the doubt, assuming positive intent.
that's such an important point. We often jump to conclusions or make assumptions about other people's intentions. It's about choosing to see the best in people.
Extending grace and understanding. And, perhaps the most powerful way to build trust is by being vulnerable ourselves, sharing our own struggles and imperfections, allowing others to see our humanity.
That's so true. Because when we're willing to be vulnerable, It gives other people permission to do the same. And that's where real connection and trust are born.
It's like a dance of vulnerability. We take turns leading and following, creating this rhythm of trust and intimacy.
I love that image. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart, I think it's clear that her work has these profound implications for how we live, how we work, and how we relate to each other. It's a guidebook for living a more wholehearted life.
It's about recognizing that our emotions are not our enemies, but rather valuable sources of information. They can guide us toward a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Mhm.
It's about having the courage to be vulnerable, to embrace our imperfections, and to show up in the world with our whole hearts.
And it's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that we're stronger together than we are alone, and that when we embrace our shared humanity, we create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Beautifully said. I'm so
Mhm.
glad we had a chance to do this deep dive together.
Yeah.
At the end of part 2, you mentioned that you wanted to end this episode with a 10-point summary of Atlas of the Heart,
Yeah.
just to kind of help solidify those key concepts.
Oh, that's right. Are you ready for a little recap?
I'm ready. Bring it on.
Okay, here are 10 key takeaways from our deep dive into Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart. Number 1, emotions are not our enemies. They're valuable sources of information that can guide us toward what matters most. Number 2, vulnerability is not weakness, it's courage. It's the foundation of connection, belonging, and trust. Number 3, we all have a limited emotional vocabulary, but we can expand it through awareness and intention. Emotional literacy is a superpower. Number 4, shame thrives in secrecy and silence. Empathy and self-compassion are the antidotes. Number 5, courage is a skill we can develop. It's about speaking up, setting boundaries, and taking risks. Number 6, gratitude is a muscle we can strengthen. It shifts our focus to the positive and amplifies joy. Number 7, joy is a gift to be cherished, not postponed. Seek it out, savor it, and let it fuel your life. Number 8, peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to remain calm and centered in the midst of it. Number 9, connection is a choice we make every day. It's about being present, listening with empathy, and extending grace. And number 10, we're all in this together. Embrace your shared humanity and create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued.
Wow, that's a powerful list. Thank you so much for guiding me through this incredible journey. Atlas of the Heart has truly opened my eyes to the power of emotions and the importance of connection.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep living wholeheartedly.
That's great advice. Until next time.
See you then.